Okay, so for my video game review, I chose to look at Assassin's Creed Rogue. It is a game in the Assassin's Creed series, which is a franchise developed by Ubisoft initially in 2007. There have been several games which have come out in the series. It's available on PS3 and Xbox, and was released with a rating of M17+, so for mature. For reasons I'll get into later, that is something to take into consideration on which class you will be using this game for, but I'll get into that later in the video. So according to Ubisoft's website, the primary conflict in all of the games in the series is between two opposing schools of thought. That is, these schools of thoughts eventually develop into two different orders, which will be the Assassins and the Templars. The Assassins kind of want to protect free will, and they believe in humanity's ability to constantly keep improving, whereas the Templars don't really agree with that, and they seek to kind of preserve society and order through limiting free will and I guess guiding how history progresses. So for specifically with Assassin's Creed Rogue, it is set in the 18th century North America during the 7 Years' War. So for this game, and I believe all the others, but I haven't played those ones, it's an open world format, which means the player can kind of roam through this virtual world and approach objectives freely, and it kind of gives them more autonomy in terms of how they seek out and complete objectives. You can see that throughout the clips while I'll be playing, but I'll touch on that in a little bit as well. So for the sake of this video, I'm going to kind of skip ahead to focus on Guy's Principles and how it relates to the Ontario Secondary School curriculum. The first one of Guy's Principles, which I want to discuss, is prevalent pretty much in the entire game. It's woven through all of the objectives and missions, but that is the principle of the psychosocial moratorium. This is the idea that learners can take risks with lower consequences than we would see in the real world. So in Assassin's Creed Rogue, this is an objective and mission-based game through which the main players are loosely guided, fulfilling a series of objectives or missions throughout the storyline. In the game, if the mission is failed, for example, if one requiring stealth, you're seen, then you go back to the checkpoint and you try the mission again. Another example of one of these missions would be you have to find Ben Franklin and deliver something to him. If the player, for example, dies first, they will be sent back to this initial checkpoint and have to begin again trying to find Ben Franklin and deliver this good. In the current clip, the player has to escape Lisbon, which is currently under siege, and they have to do so navigating a variety of obstacles and tasks getting out of the city alive. In either dying or failing the mission or objective, the main real consequence is that the player may lose some progress they have made since their last checkpoint, but checkpoints are relatively common, and the progress which they have lost is pretty much exclusively towards their current mission, not for the game on a whole. So any progress they may have lost is relatively small in comparison to the progress they may be making over the course of the entire game. This really emulates Guy's principle of the psychosocial moratorium because the only risk is really losing a small amount of the progress they have made, or maybe potentially an item they acquired while fulfilling that objective. However, these consequences are small and short-term, and the player can attempt to complete this mission or objective as many times as they wish. And this allows players to play the game a little bit more freely, taking more risks and learning, practicing, and progressing throughout the experience. I mentioned before, this mission, objective, checkpoint-based progress in the game is woven throughout the entire game. So as you get further through the game, it's not necessarily that the risks of trying something or trying an objective or mission will be any higher. Players will have the opportunity to repeat any of these objectives throughout the entire game. So in effect, Guy's Principle is modeled through the entire game as well. This next clip will be depicting exploring, navigating, and hunting in Assassin's Creed Rogue. This is going to be showcasing another one of Guy's Principles, which is the regime of competency principle. And this is the idea that the learner has ample opportunity to kind of play within, but at the outer edge of their competency or their abilities. So this means that the game is going to be frequently challenging, but nothing which you do is going to be seen as undoable or impossible. In Assassin's Creed, this is done through the process of leveling up, and when that happens, a player levels up, and the objectives or other characters which might be fighting or challenging your main character, your main player, have a higher degree of difficulty and are a little bit more challenging to defeat. This works really well because if a player is performing well at low levels, they'll level up really quickly until they are challenged, and then maybe this rate of leveling up will decrease a little bit. So one of the ways which you can level up in Assassin's Creed is to hunt. Hunting is a good way to level up for two main different reasons. One of them is that it's really good to allow players to navigate relatively freely in the process of hunting. They can explore this open world map a little bit better and get a better sense of how their character moves and things like that. Through hunting, players have the opportunity to practice with a variety of different weapons they'll be using throughout the course of the game and kind of hone their combat skills, which are essential for going forward in a lot of the objectives. So this is really useful, but the whole process of hunting is a great way to practice in a low-risk environment. This relates back to Guy's principle of the psychosocial moratorium. In this specific example of hunting, the lower consequences that you would face would be the potential of dying, but that's pretty much as severe as it gets because hunting is almost exclusively in the game to allow players to practice skills and acquire different resources they might need to craft stronger weapons or improve their health. But it's not really embroiled with any of the main objectives or storylines of the game. So there isn't even a severe risk of losing any progress. It's just potentially going back to a checkpoint, but not losing progress in the mission of itself. So through practicing and hunting, Assassin's Creed Rogue really emulates two of Guy's principles, not just one. Moving on to how Assassin's Creed can be used in the context of the Ontario Secondary School classroom, I would recommend using this as a resource for the World History since the 15th Century course. This course traces major developments and events in world history since approximately 1450, and students are expected to explore social, economic, and political changes, historical roots of contemporary issues, and the role of conflict and cooperation throughout the world. It's designed to extend their ability to apply concepts of historical thinking, including cause and consequence, historical perspective, and the inquiry process. Additionally, students are expected to interpret and analyze different evidence, but also different sources, including videos, secondary sources from renowned historians, as well as potentially video games can provide wonderful insights into how we think of different events in history through their depictions in things like movies and videos, as well as articles. This game will have particular ties to Strand C of this course's curriculum, which is the Communities, Conflict, and Cooperation strand. And this is where students are supposed to analyze interactions between different groups in various regions of the world from 1650 to 1789 and how various forces affected the world in that time period. More specifically in the curricular expectation C2-1, where they're supposed to analyze causes and consequences of these wars and the impact on different people and their perspectives on this war. So for the relation to this video game, we see the 7 Years' War play out not only in America and a variety of American cities, but through Port-au-Prince in Haiti or the destruction of Lisbon in Portugal. There are obvious main key players of the time period being depicted, such as Benjamin Franklin. There's also a lot of gain that can be made in just analyzing different interactions between people as different types of people are depicted, including some Native Americans. There are former slaves as well as current slaves depicted, and the interactions between each of these groups of people can provide some critical insight not only into was this true or not, but how we remember what happened and how we think of those relationships, which touches on another very important specific expectation, which is C2-3, in analyzing the impact of the slave trade during this period on various societies around the world and various groups of people within countries, while we're exploring different sources as well, which is an important thing to keep in mind. When considering the M17 plus rating in Assassin's Creed Rogue, this is largely because of a lot of the combat scenes in the game. And these include an extensive series of naval combat scenes and missions, which the player is actively immersed in and play a critical role in either winning these battles or losing these battles. And this can be a very important and useful teaching technique because it not only highlights some of the causes and especially consequences of these wars happening at this time, but allows them to immerse themselves into what it would have been like to be a soldier on these ships at the time, which connects back to our other historical thinking concept in this strand, which is historical perspective. Another course where this game might prove particularly useful because a lot of the gameplay does take place in the United States of America before the United States of America was a country, would be the grade 11 American History University level course. Just keep in mind the rating of an M17 plus and potentially get parental consent as well as consent from administration at the school before this game is utilized, because it can be quite violent as well. In conclusion, I think this game is really useful in the classroom because it does incorporate several of Guy's principles, as well as having strong curricular ties to the ministry guidelines in Ontario. Plus, it can be a lot of fun, and it is a very popular game series, which also has a feature film which came out last year as well, so it can connect to a lot of the students' interests.